She drew the revolver before he could reach for her bag. Ethan Walker's hand froze mid-air. The whole street went quiet. That was the moment he knew this woman was going to be nothing like what he expected, and everything he never knew he needed. If you're new here, subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss a single chapter of this story. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to stay with you. The stagecoach was 40 minutes late. Ethan Walker stood at the edge of the Millhaven depot, with his hat pulled low and his arms crossed over his chest, watching the road, the way a man watches weather he doesn't trust. The summer sun had been brutal that morning, the kind that turned the Montana high country gold and merciless before 8 o'clock. And he hadn't slept the night before, which meant his patience was already running thin before the day had properly started. He'd told himself this was practical. That's what he kept saying to himself the whole ride down from the ridge. Practical. The ranch needed managing. The books needed balancing. He needed someone who could hold the household together while he worked the horses, someone who wouldn't fall apart the first time a snowstorm rolled in off the peaks. He hadn't been looking for a wife so much as he'd been looking for a solution. And a mail-order arrangement had seemed at the time like the cleanest kind. No courtship, no pretending. No one getting the wrong idea. He'd written a letter to an agency in St. Louis 6 months ago. Clear, specific, economical with his words, the way he was economical with everything else. He'd said he needed a woman who could cook, keep house, endure the winters, and expect nothing sentimental in return. He'd offered a roof, a wage, and his last name. He had not expected a reply at all. The letter that came back was written in a hand so controlled it was almost aggressive. Abigail Reed, 29, former schoolteacher. She didn't ask about the view, or the weather, or whether the nearest town had a church. She asked about the acreage, the water supply, and whether he owned or leased the land. She signed her name without a flourish. He'd written back the same day. Now the stagecoach was pulling into Millhaven, and Ethan straightened up, watching the door, telling himself he was not nervous. He was not anything. He was just a man waiting on a practical arrangement. The door swung open. A woman stepped down, and every reasonable thought he'd had about practicality stumbled and caught itself on something it hadn't expected. She wasn't what he'd pictured. He hadn't let himself picture much, but whatever vague image had existed in the back of his mind. This wasn't it. She was travel-worn, dusty, her dark dress wrinkled from days in a rattling coach, but she moved like someone who hadn't been humbled by any of it. Her chin was level. Her eyes swept the street with the measured calm of a woman taking inventory, not a woman arriving somewhere new and hoping to be welcomed. She had one bag, one, and she'd set it down herself before anyone could offer to help. Ethan stepped forward. It was instinct: reach for the bag, take the weight the way you do. Basic courtesy. He never got close. The woman's hand moved to the side of her coat, and when it came back, there was a revolver in it. Not raised, not pointed, just held at her hip, casual as a handshake. Her eyes found him and stayed there. "Don't touch my things." Her voice was low and even, and didn't shake even a little. The whole depot went still. Someone behind Ethan sucked in a breath. He heard the shuffle of boots on wood as people stepped back. Millhaven was a small town, and small towns had long memories and short tolerances for disruption, and every soul on that platform was watching to see what Ethan Walker was going to do. Ethan didn't move. He looked at the revolver. He looked at the woman holding it. He looked at her eyes, which were the color of creek water in August, cool and deep, and entirely unafraid. Then slowly he held up both hands. Not in surrender, just in acknowledgement. "All right," he said. She held his gaze for another 3 seconds, counting, he realized later, making sure he meant it. Then she lowered the gun and slid it back into her coat. "Ethan Walker," she said. "That's right. Abigail Reed." She picked up her bag herself. "Which way is your horse?" He stared at her for a moment. Then he turned and led the way without another word. Behind them, Millhaven started talking. He could feel it before he heard it, the low vibration of whispers working their way through a crowd. He'd grown up in this town. He knew the sound of it. It wasn't kind. That's her then. Heard she got run out of Caldwell County. Something about money, school money. Whole board voted her out, unanimous. Ethan kept walking. Abigail walked beside him without looking back, which told him she'd heard it too and had decided not to give it anything. They reached his horse, a dark bay quarter horse named Silas, solid and stubborn and loyal, tied at the post outside the general store. Abigail looked at the horse. She looked at the single saddle. "I'll take the back," she said. It wasn't a question. "I've got a buckboard at the livery," Ethan said. "Down the block." "Oh," she paused. "All right." That was all she said. The ride up to the ranch took 2 hours, and they did not speak for most of it. Ethan had expected that silence would be comfortable. Silence was always comfortable for him. He'd spent 10 years building his life around the particular piece of not having to explain himself to anyone, and he'd gotten very good at it. But this silence was different. This silence had a texture to it. It wasn't empty. It was full of things that hadn't been said yet, things that were waiting to see whether they'd be welcome. And the pressure of that made the 2 hours feel considerably longer. He glanced at her once. She was looking out at the valley below, at the sweeping open grass of the high country, the line of blue mountains at the far edge. The way the afternoon light was starting to angle gold across the whole of it. Her expression wasn't wonder. It was something quieter than wonder. Recognition, maybe, like she'd seen hard country before and knew what it asked of you. He looked back at the road. "The house has 2 bedrooms," he said. "I'll take the one off the kitchen. You can have the one upstairs." She turned slightly toward him. "What happened to the previous owner of the upstairs room?" He gripped the reins a little tighter. "There wasn't one." She said nothing for a moment. Then carefully, "The agency told me you were widowed." "I wasn't." Another pause. "Engaged." He didn't answer. She seemed to understand that the silence meant yes because she didn't push further. She just looked back out at the mountains. "I'm sorry," she said. And it didn't sound like she was filling space with it. It sounded like she meant it. He nodded once and said nothing. They reached the ranch as the sun was dropping behind the western ridge. Ethan pulled the buckboard to a stop in front of the house and climbed down. He watched without interfering as Abigail climbed down. Herself picked up her bag and stood looking at the property with her head slightly tilted. The house was rough but solid. Timber framing a wide front porch, a stone chimney that worked. The barn was bigger than the house, which was as it should be. There were 3 corrals, one for the working horses, one for the mares, one empty now because he'd lost most of the young stock to the drought 2 summers back and hadn't fully rebuilt. "Where do you want me to start?" Abigail asked. He blinked. "It's nearly dark." "I know, but there's still light for another 30 minutes. She glanced at the barn. "Your hay's been turned wrong. I could see it from the road. You'll get mold in the center bales if it's not corrected." He stared at her. "I grew up in farm country," she said. "Not defensive, just explanatory." "The hay can wait," he said. "Mold can't." He opened his mouth, closed it. Then, "Fine, barn's unlocked." She was already walking toward it. Dinner that night was her cooking, which was better than he'd expected, and eating in silence, which was not better than he'd expected. It was worse because she sat across the table from him and ate with the kind of composed attention that made him aware of every sound his fork made. He cleared his plate. She cleared hers. She washed both without asking whether he usually did that himself. "The schedule," she said, drying her hands. "What time do you start in the morning?" 4:30. She nodded. "I'll have coffee ready at 4. "You don't have to." "I want to be useful," she said. And the way she said it, not eager, not pleading, just straightforward and a little fierce, stopped him from arguing. 4 o'clock then, he said. "Good night, Mr. Walker." "Ethan?" She paused in the doorway, looked back. "Good night, Ethan." Then she climbed the stairs, and he sat alone in his kitchen in the dark for a long time, listening to the sound of a person moving around in the room above him, which was a sound this house had never held before. It was louder than he'd expected. Not unpleasant. He wasn't sure what to do with that. The trouble started 3 days later, and it started in town. Ethan had gone down to the mill for lumber he needed to repair the fence line on the east pasture before the summer grazing season moved into full swing, and he'd brought Abigail with him because there were provisions to collect, and it made more sense than 2 trips. He left her at the general store and went to deal with the lumber order. When he came back 45 minutes later, she was standing outside the store with her bag of provisions at her feet, and there were 3 women arranged across the boardwalk in front of her, like a wall. He knew all 3 of them. Eleanor Mast, who ran the seamstress shop, Judith Carey, whose husband owned the bank, and Ruth Danforth, who didn't run anything official, but who had more influence over the social direction of Millhaven than any elected official ever had. He slowed the buckboard and listened before he pulled up. "We just think you ought to know," Ruth Danforth was saying in the particular tone she used when she wanted to seem like she was doing someone a favor. "People talk. It was all over Caldwell County before you ever left. The school board was very clear about what they found." "I'm sure they were," Abigail said. $40 missing from the school fund, in your care." "That's what the report said." "Isn't that enough?" Eleanor Mast said. "For you to understand why people here might have concerns?" "About what?" Abigail's voice hadn't changed. It hadn't gotten louder or tighter or wobbled. "About whether I'll steal your children's arithmetic money. I didn't come here to teach school, Mrs. Mast. I came here to run a household, and I haven't taken anything that didn't belong to me." The fact remains, Abigail said, and now there was something harder in it. Not anger exactly, but something that had been through anger and come out the other side. "That you don't know me. You know a rumor, and rumor and fact are not the same thing no matter how long a town has been treating them that way." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Judith Carey looked past Abigail and saw Ethan sitting in the buckboard. Her expression shifted that particular embarrassed recalibration of a person caught doing something they knew wasn't right. "Mr. Walker," she said. He climbed down from the buckboard. He picked up Abigail's provision bag. He looked at all 3 women without saying anything for long enough that Ruth Danforth started to look uncomfortable. "Ladies," he said finally. Then he put his hand on Abigail's arm, not holding her, just a brief touch at the elbow steady, and walked her to the buckboard. She climbed up. He climbed up. He turned the horses, and they left Millhaven behind. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, "You all right?" "I've been all right through worse," she said. He nodded. And then, because he couldn't quite stop himself, "What did happen in Caldwell County?" She looked at her hands in her lap. "Something I'm not ready to talk about yet." He accepted that. He didn't know why he accepted it so easily, but he did. "All right," he said. What he didn't accept was the colt incident 4 days after that. He'd come back from checking the north fence to find the east corral gate standing open, and one of his young horses, a sorrel colt he'd been training since January, loose in the near pasture, running circles with his head up and his nostrils flared. Getting a horse worked up like that before it was ready set the training back by weeks. He found Abigail at the fence line watching the colt, and the frustration came out before he could arrange it better. "What happened to the gate?" She turned. "I opened it." "Why?" "Because he was standing with his head against the corner post. He'd been doing it for an hour. That's not a resting horse, Ethan, that's a distressed one. He's a green colt. He gets distressed if a cloud moves wrong. He needed to move. He needed to stay in the corral where I put him." Ethan's voice had gone flat, which was what happened when he was keeping it from going sharp. "That colt is 6 months into training. If he runs himself stupid out there, we lose everything I've put into him." Abigail met his eyes without flinching. "Then go get him." "I'm asking you not to interfere with the horses." "I wasn't interfering. I was watching." And when I see an animal in distress, you don't know these horses. I know distress, she said. The words were quiet and landed like something heavier than words. He looked at her. She looked at him. He went and got the colt. It took 20 minutes and cost him his temper twice. And when he finally had the horse back in the corral and latched the gate himself, he leaned against the post and breathed. He could see her through the gap she'd gone to the garden bed along the south wall of the house and was pulling weeds with her back to him. He watched her work for a long moment. Then he went inside and didn't bring it up again. It was the child that broke something open in him. 3 weeks after Abigail's arrival, Ethan woke at just past 2 in the morning with the particular alertness of a man whose body had learned over years to wake at any sound that didn't belong. He lay still and listened. There, a voice. Low, coming from downstairs. He got up, pulled on his boots, and came down the stairs quietly. There was a lamp lit in the kitchen, turned low, and sitting at the table were Abigail and a girl. She was maybe 8 years old, small and thin, wearing a dress that was too big and too old for her. She had a primer open in front of her, and Abigail's hand was over hers guiding a pencil. They hadn't heard him on the stairs. He stopped at the bottom and watched. Try again. Abigail was saying, her voice so gentle it seemed to belong to a different version of her than the one he'd been living alongside. You're sounding it out, right? You just don't trust yourself yet. The girl frowned at the page, formed the word with her mouth before she said it. Cat. That's exactly right. The girl's face changed. It was only a small shift, a private, careful brightness. But it was the kind of thing that once you'd seen it, you couldn't unfocus your eyes from. Who's the girl? He asked from the doorway. Both of them startled. Abigail's hand went briefly toward her coat before she registered it was him, and then she exhaled. Clara Benton, she said. She's from the Hendersons' place. They took her in after her parents passed last spring, but She paused. They're not a reading household. She's out at 2 in the morning. She walks here. She has been for almost 2 weeks. Abigail looked at him steadily. I was going to tell you. The girl Clara was watching him with enormous, careful eyes, the kind of eyes that had already learned to read a room. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed the kitchen to the stove, moved the kettle onto the heat, and pulled a chair back from the table on his side of it. What letter are you on? He said. Clara blinked at him. Sir? In the lesson. What letter? We're reading words now, with 2 letters. He nodded. All right. He sat. Go ahead then. Abigail looked at him across the table. He didn't look back at her. He didn't want to see whatever was in her face just yet. Clara came 3 nights that week, then 4. Ethan never said she wasn't welcome, which meant in this household that she was. He started sleeping lighter. Not because it troubled him, because he was listening for the sound of the latch, so he'd know when she arrived and could have the kettle on before Abigail came down. He told himself this was practical too. He was getting less convincing on that front. One morning, near the end of the 3rd week, he found Abigail in the barn before dawn. Not doing anything she wasn't supposed to, she was brushing down one of the mares, slow and even, talking quietly to the horse the way some people talk to animals when they think nobody can hear. He stood in the doorway. You couldn't sleep, he said. She didn't stop brushing. I sleep fine. It's 4 in the morning. So is it for you? He came in and went to Silas's stall. He started his own routine in silence for a few minutes. Then, you ever miss it teaching? Her hand slowed on the mare's neck. Every day. You were good at it. I was. No false modesty, no performance. Just an honest statement about a thing that had been taken from her. What happened? He stopped himself. You said you weren't ready. I'm not, she resumed brushing. But I will be, eventually. He nodded. He didn't push, but he thought about what Ruth Danforth had said. $40. And he thought about Clara at his kitchen table at 2 in the morning, learning to read from a woman who had nothing left to prove to anyone and was doing it anyway. And something in the math of it didn't sit right. He didn't say that either. Not yet. Yet, the thing he hadn't said out loud to himself, hadn't allowed himself to, was how different the ranch felt. It wasn't just the coffee at 4 o'clock, though. That was part of it. It wasn't the mended fence line, or the correctly turned hay bales, or the kitchen that didn't smell like 3 days of his own bad cooking. It was the way the house held sound now. The way there was always something happening. Movement, voice, a lamp burning somewhere when he came in off a late ride. He hadn't known he'd noticed the absence of those things until they were there again. He'd lived alone for 10 years. He'd told himself he'd built a good life out of it. And it hadn't been a lie exactly. It had just been incomplete. And he was beginning to understand the difference. He was also beginning to understand that Abigail Reed was not a woman he could treat as a solution to anything. She was too specific for that. Too real. She had opinions about the horse training and the hay and what time dinner ought to be served, and half the time those opinions were right, which he was finding both irritating and quietly, stubbornly something else he didn't have a name for yet. She deserved something better than what he'd offered her in that letter. He didn't know yet what to do with that knowledge, but he was starting to think he was going to have to figure it out. The letter arrived on a Thursday. He didn't see it first. Abigail had walked down to collect the post while he was working the corral, and when she came back, she was holding it at her side with the particular stillness of someone who had already read the outside of it and knew it wasn't good. She put it on the kitchen table without saying anything and went back to what she'd been doing. He picked it up that evening. The return address was a law office in Caldwell County. He didn't open it immediately. He turned it over in his hands, and he thought about the 3 women on the boardwalk and the $40, and the way Abigail had said something I'm not ready to talk about yet, with the voice of a person who had been carrying something too long to be casual about it. He thought about Clara, who walked alone in the dark because someone had taught her something worth walking for. He set the letter back down. He didn't open it. That wasn't his to open. When Abigail came through the kitchen an hour later, she looked at the letter still on the table and looked at him. "You didn't read it," she said. "It's addressed to you." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thank you." He nodded and went back to his books. She picked up the letter. She stood with her back to him for a long moment before she opened it. He heard the paper. He didn't look up. Then, Ethan. Her voice was different, stripped of its control just for a second. He looked up. She turned around, and her face was... He didn't have words for her face in that moment. It was the face of someone who has been holding a weight so long they've forgotten what it felt like not to, and something has just shifted, and they're not sure yet whether to trust it. "It's about my brother," she said. He waited. "Someone's been asking questions," she said. "In Caldwell County. About the money." He kept his voice level. "Who? It doesn't say." She folded the letter carefully, set it on the table. "But someone is asking." He watched her sit down. He watched her put both hands flat on the table, pressing down, steadying herself with the solidity of the wood. He thought again about the math that didn't add up. "Abigail," he said. She looked at him. "Whatever happened in Caldwell County," he said slowly, "I don't think you took that money." The silence that followed was so complete, he could hear the horses shifting in the barn 50 yards away. She looked at him for a very long time. "No," she said finally. "I didn't." He nodded. Just once. "All right," he said. And in the space of those 2 words was everything he couldn't yet say, that he believed her, that it mattered that something had changed in this house without either of them deciding to change it, and that he was going to have to live with whatever that meant. She picked up the letter again, held it to her chest for a moment, eyes closed. Then she got up, set the kettle on, and made them both coffee, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table while the night closed in around the house on the mountain, and neither of them said anything more. But neither of them left either, and that Ethan thought was something. The letter sat on the kitchen table for 3 days before either of them mentioned it again. Not because they forgot it was there. Because they both knew it was there, and knowing was enough for now. Ethan went about his mornings the way he always had horses. First fence checks, second bookwork in the evenings, and Abigail went about hers. And the letter stayed between them like a stone in a creek bed, patient and unmoved while the water ran around it. On the 4th morning, Ethan came in from the barn at 6:30 and found the letter gone. He didn't ask where. He figured she'd made a decision about it, and it wasn't his decision to question. What he didn't expect was to find her at the corral fence an hour later, watching the sorrel colt with the same steady, unreadable attention she gave to most things. "He's moving better," she said without turning around. Ethan stopped beside her. The colt was working the far railhead down and relaxed, nothing like the panicked animal she'd let loose 3 weeks ago. "He is. You changed the feed rotation. You suggested it." She glanced at him sideways. "I didn't think you were listening." "I was listening," he said. "I just didn't want to say so at the time." Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but almost. He went back to work, and she went back to the house, and that was the closest thing to peace they'd had since she arrived. He let himself think just briefly that maybe they'd found a way to do this to live alongside each other, without it costing either of them too much. He should have known better than to think that on a Thursday, because Thursday was the day Walt Greer rode up the hill. Ethan heard the horse before he saw the rider, that particular unhurried clip of a man who wasn't in any hurry because he was confident he'd already arrived before he got there. He came out of the barn and stood in the yard, and Walt Greer pulled up on a big gray gelding and looked down at him with the flat, satisfied expression of a man delivering news he'd been looking forward to delivering. Walt Greer owned the largest cattle operation in the valley. He also sat on the county land committee, served as the informal treasurer of the Millhaven Business Association, and had been trying for 7 years to acquire the water rights attached to the eastern edge of Ethan's property. Ethan had declined every offer. They both remembered that clearly. "Walker," Walt said. "Greer. Heard you took on a woman?" "I did." Walt's eyes moved to the house, then back. "Heard some things about her." "I imagine you did." "Just thought you ought to know," Walt began. "I know what you thought," Ethan said. His voice was level. It was always level. That was the thing about Ethan Walker. He didn't raise his voice, which meant when it went cold, it went very cold. "And I'll tell you the same thing I told the Danforth woman, and the same thing I'll tell anyone else who rides up here to tell me what I ought to know about my own household. I appreciate the concern, and I don't need it." Walt looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, reassessment, recalculation. "Woman's got a reputation, Ethan." "So do I. Doesn't make it the whole truth." Another pause. Then Walt's gaze drifted past him again, and Ethan didn't turn around, but he felt it, the particular awareness of someone standing behind him. He didn't have to look to know. "Mr. Greer." Abigail's voice was calm and direct the way it always was. He heard her footsteps on the porch, then on the packed dirt of the yard. She came to stand beside Ethan, not behind him. Beside him. "I don't believe we've met." "Ma'am?" Walt touched his hat, reluctant courtesy. "Walt Greer." "I know who you are," she said. "You made an offer on this land 2 years ago. Ethan turned it down. I read the records when I was going through the ranch books." She looked up at the gelding, then back at Walt. "Is this a social call, or is there something we can help you with?" The "we" landed like a stone dropped in still water. Walt heard it. Ethan heard it. They all did. Walt's jaw tightened fractionally. "Just passing through," he said. "Safe riding then," Abigail said. Walt looked at Ethan one more time, something in it that wasn't quite a warning, but wasn't quite not. Then he turned the gelding and rode back down the hill the way he'd come. Ethan stood in the yard and watched him go. Abigail stood beside him and did the same. When the rider had cleared the tree line, Ethan said, "You didn't have to come out." "I know," she said. "I had it handled." "I know that too." He glanced at her. She was still watching the tree line with her arms crossed, not combative, just present. Like she'd made a decision and wasn't second-guessing it. "You read the ranch records," he said. "When I first arrived, I wanted to understand the operation I'd agreed to help run." She paused. "Greer's been trying to get to that east water line for years. He won't stop at a social call." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "He won't." They stood there for another few seconds, and then Abigail turned and went back to the house, and Ethan stayed in the yard, and thought about the word "we" and what it had sounded like coming out of her mouth, and decided he wasn't going to examine that too carefully right now. The argument that blew open between them that evening had been building for a week, maybe longer, and it started the way the worst arguments always do over something small. He came inside at dusk to find she'd rearranged the bookshelf in the front room. It wasn't a grand gesture. She'd moved his surveying maps to the lower shelf and put the account ledgers at eye level, which was objectively more logical. But the maps had been on that shelf since he'd put them there 9 years ago, and something about their absence from where they were supposed to be lit a short fuse he hadn't known was burning. "Those were in order," he said. Abigail looked up from the table where she was writing a list. "They're still in order, just lower. I know where I put things." "You put the current season ledgers behind the 1879 survey maps. I was trying to find the July feed costs for an hour before I gave up." "You could have asked me." She put her pen down. "You were in the north pasture. Then you could have waited." "Ethan?" Her voice was patient in the way that patience sometimes sounds like the last available option. "I'm trying to help manage this ranch. I can't manage what I can't find." "I didn't ask you to manage the books." "No. You asked me to keep the house, cook the meals, and stay out of the way. And I've done 2 of those 3 things, so I thought we were making progress." She stood up. "But I'm not going to be useful to you if I'm not allowed to actually be useful. There's a difference between useful and what?" She looked at him directly. "Capable, competent, telling you when something doesn't make sense." He stopped. She picked up her pen. "If you want to put the maps back where they were, put them back. I'll find another way to work around it." Her voice had gone quiet, and quiet on her was more pointed than raised. "But I came up here to be a partner in running something, not to cook and curtsy and disappear. If that's not what you need, you should have been clearer in the letter." He stood in the doorway for a long, taut moment. Then he walked across the room and put his maps back on the lower shelf where she'd moved them. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. But she turned back to her writing, and something in her shoulders that had been braced since he walked in came down slightly, and he noticed that, and he put it somewhere careful. Clara was the one who made him see it clearly. The girl had been coming 4 nights a week now, regular as weather, and she'd taken to arriving early enough that she and Abigail would be sitting at the table already deep into a lesson by the time Ethan finished his last round of the evening. He'd stopped pretending not to listen. He'd pull a chair to the far side of the kitchen and work on harness repairs or account figures, and the reading lesson would go on around him, and it had become the quietest, steadiest part of his day. One night, about 3 weeks in, Clara had looked up from her primer and across at him with the particular directness of a child who hasn't yet learned that some questions are supposed to be kept internal. "Did you go to school?" she asked. "I did," Ethan said without looking up from the harness. "Did you like it?" He thought about it honestly. "Some of it." "What parts?" "Reading, maps." He set the harness down. "The parts that help me understand where things were and how they fit together." Clara absorbed this. Then, "Miss Abigail says reading is like a key, that once you have it, there's no door you can't open." He looked at Abigail. She was watching the girl with an expression he hadn't seen before, completely unguarded. Warm in a way she'd had no particular reason to show him yet, and so quietly glad that it made something in his chest pull in a direction he hadn't given it permission to pull. "She's right," he said. His voice came out lower than he intended. Abigail looked up and caught him looking. He looked back down at the harness. She looked back at Clara. "From the top," she said gently. Try the whole page.
Chapter.
The morning the Henderson boy rode up was the morning everything that had been settling underneath the surface broke through. Ethan was at the fence line when he heard shouting from the direction of the house. Not fear, anger, and he was moving before he fully registered it, covering the ground between the north pasture and the yard at a pace that was not quite running, because running meant something he wasn't ready to say out loud. He came around the side of the barn to find Abigail on the porch, her arms crossed, looking down at a boy of maybe 16, who was standing in the yard with his hat in his hands and his face somewhere between threatening and ashamed. Behind him, hanging back at the gate, were two older men Ethan recognized from the Henderson ranch crew. "You tell her to stop coming," the boy was saying. "Clara ain't got no business sneaking out at night, and it's your fault she thinks she does." "Clara is learning to read," Abigail said. Her voice was controlled. Her hands were not. She was gripping her own arms too hard. "That's nobody's fault, and nothing to be stopped." "Her guardian says—" "Her guardian," Abigail said, "sends her to sleep in an unheated back room and doesn't own a single book. I don't think her guardian's opinion on her education carries a great deal of moral weight." The boy took a step forward. It wasn't quite a threat, but it was heading that direction. That was when Ethan came around the corner and stepped up onto the porch, standing next to Abigail, not in front of her, and looked down at the boy without saying anything at all. The boy stopped. Ethan waited. He had a particular gift for waiting. It was one of the things that made him effective with difficult horses and difficult men. "Son," he said finally, "I understand Mr. Henderson has concerns. He's welcome to ride up himself and discuss them with me directly. You and these two gentlemen at my gate are going to turn around now and go back down the hill." The older man at the gate shifted his weight. You were just leaving," Ethan said. "That's what you were just doing." A long moment. The boy looked at Abigail, and Abigail looked at the boy steadily without yielding an inch. Then the boy put his hat back on, turned and walked back to the gate. The two men turned with him. Ethan watched until the three of them were down the road and out of sight. Then he turned to Abigail. She was staring straight ahead, jaw tight, and her hands, when she finally uncrossed her arms, were shaking just slightly, barely visible, the residual tremor of a person who held themselves still through things and then had to let the cost of it go somewhere. "Abigail, I'm fine," she said. "I know you're fine. That's not what I'm asking." She looked at him. Something behind her eyes moved, shifted, reconsidered. "I won't stop teaching her. I'm not asking you to. If Henderson comes up here with a legal complaint, then I'll deal with Henderson." His voice didn't change. "You hear me? I'll deal with it." She looked at him for 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds he watched something in her decide carefully, reluctantly to believe him. "All right," she said. She went inside. He stayed on the porch for a moment, hands on the rail, looking down the empty road. He thought about how she'd looked when she thought the boy was going to step forward. Not frightened, ready. Her whole body had gone very still in the way of something that has already decided what it will do if it has to. She'd been facing things alone for a long time. He could see the shape of that now, the way you can sometimes see a thing more clearly once you know what you're looking at. He didn't like the shape of it. 3 days later, a second letter came from Caldwell County. This one wasn't addressed to Abigail. It was addressed to him. He looked at it for a while before he opened it. It was from a man named Gerald Ames, who identified himself as a county records clerk. The letter was short and precisely worded the way letters are when someone is being careful about what they commit to paper. It said that certain discrepancies had recently come to light in the Caldwell County school fund accounts. It said that an independent review had been requested. It said that if Mr. Walker had any relevant information regarding the prior disposition of those funds or the individuals involved in their administration, Mr. Ames would appreciate a correspondence at his earliest convenience. Ethan read it twice. Then he folded it, put it in the chest pocket of his shirt, and went to find Abigail. She was in the garden. He handed her the letter without preamble. She read it standing up, and he watched her face as she did the careful stillness she kept over it, the way her eyes went back to certain lines, twice the way she exhaled slowly through her nose at the end. "Gerald Ames," she said. "You know him. He was new to the records office when everything happened. He didn't vote on the board decision, he wasn't part of the board. He was just the clerk." She refolded the letter. "He was one of 3 people in that building who looked at me like they weren't sure." "Not sure of what?" "Not sure I'd done it." She handed the letter back to him. Her voice was absolutely controlled, but her eyes weren't quite. "Someone's been going back through the books. Somebody thinks the numbers don't add up." "Somebody's finally looking at the numbers," she said, and there was something in it that wasn't hope. Exactly because hope was a thing she'd learned to be careful with, but it was adjacent to hope. Right next door to it. He watched her stand there with the garden behind her and the summer burning overhead and that letter between them, and he thought about a woman who had taken a blame she hadn't earned to protect someone she loved, and who had then gotten on a stagecoach alone and traveled to a stranger's mountain ranch with 1 bag and a revolver, and who had turned the hay bales right and mended 2 sections of fence and taught a little girl to read in the dark and stood on a porch without flinching. And he thought about the letter he'd written 6 months ago with its efficient, impersonal list of requirements. He thought she deserved better than that letter. "I'd like to write back to him," he said. "To Ames." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I have some questions about those accounts, and because a man who owns property and pays taxes in this territory has standing to ask them." She was very quiet for a moment. "Ethan, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He met her eyes. "I want to." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he started to wonder if he'd said something wrong. Then she looked down at the garden and back up, and when she looked at him again, something had shifted. Something had come down some careful internal barrier she'd maintained since the moment she stepped off that stagecoach. And whatever was underneath it was tired and true and a little bit undone. "Thank you," she said, quietly, like she meant it down to the root. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Ames might not know anything useful." "That's not what I'm thanking you for." He didn't ask what she meant. He was fairly sure he knew. And he was fairly sure that if she said it plainly, he would have to admit something plainly in return, and he wasn't quite ready for that. Not yet. But he was getting there. The last thing that happened in that 4th week, the thing that cracked something in him that had been solid for 10 years, happened on a Sunday night when neither of them was expecting anything at all. He'd been awake late working through the summer grazing figures, and he'd heard her come downstairs around midnight, not for Clara, because Clara had been kept home all week since the Henderson confrontation, just for herself. He heard the familiar sounds of the kettle and a chair at the table, and he stayed where he was in the front room, because she didn't know he was still up, and some instinct told him to leave her the space. But then he heard something else. Just once, brief, quickly suppressed. A sound that had no place in the vocabulary of the woman he'd been living beside. He set down his pencil. He crossed the front room and stopped in the kitchen doorway. She was sitting at the table with a letter in her hands. Not the Ames letter, an older one worn at the folds from being opened and closed too many times. She had her back mostly to him, and she'd already gotten herself back under control, but her eyes were bright and her jaw was set in the way of someone who has just demanded something back from themselves. He took a breath. He crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her. She looked up, startled, composing herself quickly. "I thought you were asleep." "Couldn't settle." He nodded at the letter. "From your brother." Her hands went still on the paper. "Yes." He waited. She looked at the letter for a long time, and then she looked at him, and then she made a decision. He could see her make, the moment it crossed from kept to shared. "His name is Thomas," she said. "He's 22. He was teaching at the same school just his first year. He made a mistake, a bad one." She paused. "He borrowed from the school fund. He meant to put it back. He'd gotten into a card game he couldn't afford, and he panicked, and he took $40 and was going to replace it before the quarterly audit." She pressed her lips together. "He didn't get it back in time, and when they found the discrepancy and started looking, She stopped. Ethan sat very still. "He's 22, she said again, like the number explained everything, like it was the whole of the argument. They were talking about prison time, or worse, and I was 28 and I was the senior teacher, and I thought—" Her voice broke just for a second, just a hairline fracture, and then she locked it back down hard. "I thought I could survive it better than he could." The kitchen was so quiet he could hear the lamp. "Does he know?" Ethan said. She shook her head. "I told him it was a misunderstanding, that I'd cleared it up and it was fine and he should go. He moved to Oregon. He has work there." "He doesn't know you took his blame." "No." "Abigail, don't." Her voice was soft but absolute. "Don't tell me I shouldn't have. I would do it again. He's my brother." Ethan sat across from her and looked at this woman who had ridden alone to a stranger's mountain and introduced herself with a revolver and turned the hay bales right and stood down the Henderson boy without moving an inch, and he understood now what all of it was built on, what it had cost her, what she'd paid for quietly by herself for more than a year. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers just briefly, just the weight of a hand, and then he took it back. "He's lucky," Ethan said, "to have you." She looked at him. Her eyes were bright. She didn't let what was in them spill. "You're the first person," she said carefully, "who has said that to me since this started." He nodded. He didn't say anything else because there wasn't anything else that needed saying, and he'd learned enough about her by now to know she didn't want to be talked at through hard things. She wanted to be sat with. So he stayed. He got up, put the kettle on, made 2 cups of coffee. She didn't ask, he didn't explain, and he came back and set one in front of her, and sat down with his own, and they sat at the kitchen table together in the small hours of a summer night, until her hands stopped gripping the letter quite so hard, and some of the brightness went out of her eyes in the way that means the weight has shifted, not gone, but shared. He'd forgotten what that felt like. The particular gravity of 2 people sitting with a hard thing together. He didn't forget it again. The letter from Gerald Ames arrived on a Monday. Ethan's reply went out on Tuesday. By Wednesday, he'd stopped expecting anything to move quickly because, in his experience, things that had been buried for more than a year didn't come back to the surface on anyone's schedule but their own. What he didn't expect was Walt Greer. Greer came back on Thursday morning, and this time he didn't ride alone. He brought his foreman, a thick-necked man named Cord Hale, who had a reputation for doing the kind of work that didn't get written down, and a younger man Ethan didn't recognize. Clean clothes, soft hands, the particular stillness of someone who was paid to watch and report. Not a ranch hand, something else. Ethan was at the water trough when they rode in. He straightened up and waited, and the waiting was the message the same way it always was. "Walker?" Greer pulled up. "Got a minute?" "Depends on what for." Greer looked past him at the house. The front door was open. Abigail was visible through the screen moving in the kitchen. Greer's eyes stayed there half a second too long. "County Land Committee's meeting next week," Greer said, looking back. "Water rights on the east boundary come up for renewal in September. Thought you'd want to know there's a new assessment process this year. Outside evaluator." He nodded toward the younger man. "Mr. Pratt here handles the preliminary reviews." Ethan looked at Pratt. Pratt looked back with the blank professionalism of a man who had done this before and knew exactly what it was. "Is that so?" Ethan said. "Just routine," Greer said. "New county ordinance. Any property with unresolved legal associations, liens, outstanding complaints, that sort of thing goes through an extended review. Could take months." He paused, and the pause was very deliberate. Years, sometimes. Ethan understood what was being said without any of it being said. He'd grown up around men like Greer. He knew the grammar of this conversation. "Greer," he said, "if you've got something to file with the county, file it. If you've got something to say to me, say it. But don't ride up here with a hired evaluator and talk to me about routine process like I don't know what routine looks like." Greer's jaw tightened. "Your woman's got a complaint pending in Caldwell County." "There's no complaint pending. There was an old board decision being reviewed. That's different." The committee might not see it that way. Then I'll explain it to the committee." Ethan stepped forward just one step and kept his voice exactly where it was, flat, unhurried, carrying the particular weight of a man who doesn't need to raise it. "And while I'm there, I might mention that the East Water assessment seems to have come up at a very interesting time. Right after you rode up to tell me what you thought about the woman living in my house." Pratt shifted in his saddle. Cord Hale looked at Greer. Greer looked at Ethan for a long moment. Then he turned his horse. "Good day, Walker." Ethan watched them ride out. He stood in the yard until he couldn't hear the horses anymore, and then he turned and Abigail was standing on the porch. The screen door was open. She'd heard most of it. "How much trouble is this?" she asked. "Some," he said honestly. "Not more than manageable." "Because of me." He looked at her. "Because of Greer. There's a difference." She held his gaze for a moment. Then, "I don't want your land at risk over my being at Abigail." He said her name the way he did when he needed her to stop and hear him. "This property has been in dispute with Greer for 7 years. It had nothing to do with you before you got here, and it's got nothing to do with you now. He's just found a new angle." He came up the porch steps. "Don't hand him that." She looked like she wanted to argue. She looked like she'd been preparing to argue for her entire life, and it was a hard habit to set down. "All right," she said finally. "Good." He went inside. "Coffee's getting cold." The dry spell had been building for 2 weeks before anyone called it a drought. Ethan felt it in the horses first, the way they were moving to the water trough earlier in the mornings. Drinking longer, their coats dulling slightly, with the kind of dehydration that said the heat was costing them something. He'd seen summers like this before. He knew what they were capable of. He started moving the southern herd to the higher pasture, where the spring-fed creek ran stronger, rotating the grazing before the lower grass gave out. He had Abigail tracking the water levels in the 3 stock tanks twice daily, which she did without comment, and reported back with the precise notational efficiency of a woman who'd kept school records and knew exactly how numbers told a story before anyone was ready to hear it. "East tank is down 14 inches since last week," she told him on a Saturday, reading from the notebook she'd started keeping. "West is holding better, it's in shade longer, but if we don't get rain in the next 10 days, we'll need to start rationing." "I know. The hay in the north bales is drying faster than it should. If it gets too dry, it'll burn," he said. She looked up from the notebook. The words sat between them. "I've been watching the ridge," he said. It was the first time he'd said it out loud to anyone. "Dead Horse Ridge, the tree line up on the eastern face. It's been brown for 3 weeks, and Hicks over the next valley lost a quarter of his fence line last summer to a grass fire that started from nothing. A kicked lantern, a dry lightning strike. What do we do? Clear the brush from the immediate yard, move anything flammable away from the barn walls." He paused. "And hope." She wrote something in the notebook. Closed it. "I'll start on the south side of the barn today." He hadn't asked her to. He didn't say so. He just nodded and went back to the horses. The fire started on a Tuesday, 11 days after Ethan had first said the word out loud. He smelled it before he saw it, that specific mix of pine resin and dry grass, the kind of smell that hits you like a warning before your brain has finished processing what it's warning you about. He was in the east pasture checking the water line, and he turned and looked up toward Dead Horse Ridge, and the smoke was already visible, not a thin column, not a small thing, but a wide, rolling bank of gray-black moving fast across the ridge with wind behind it. He ran, not to the house, to the corral. First horses, because panicked horses in an enclosed space with fire coming were a disaster faster than anything else on a ranch. He hit the gate at a full sprint, threw it open, slapped the nearest mare on the flank to get her moving, and started driving them toward the lower pasture gate, which opened to the open meadow, the one direction the fire wasn't coming from. "Ethan!" Abigail's voice came across the yard. She'd seen it. She was already moving. She'd come out of the barn with a lead rope in her hand and read the situation without needing it, explained. "How many in the south corral?" "4, the gate sticks lift and pull." She was already there. He heard the gate give. He got the east pasture horses moving and ran back for the barn. The wind was shifting. He could feel it changing direction, feel it in the way the smoke smell was suddenly everywhere instead of directional. And that was the thing that told him this was going to be faster than he'd planned for. Clara. The thought arrived like a cold hand. Clara sometimes came in the mornings now. Not for lessons, just to help Abigail with the garden small work, the kind a child offers when she wants to be somewhere she feels welcome. He hadn't seen her today, but he hadn't been looking. He turned toward the house. "Abigail, is Clara here?" "She went home an hour ago," Abigail called back. "She's not here." One thing he didn't have to carry. He went back to the barn. He got 4 of the 6 working horses out before the smoke hit the barn proper, that low, thick bank that drops below the rafters and starts filling lungs. And the remaining 2 horses felt it and went sideways in their stalls, throwing their heads, whites of their eyes showing. He went in anyway. He got a hand on the first one, got the halter on by feeling the smoke, talked low and steady. The way he'd learned 2 years ago. Not the words, just the sound, the rhythm, the specific human presence that told a frightened animal, "I am here, I am here, I am here," and walked the horse out. He handed the lead rope to Abigail, who was at the barn door with a wet cloth over her nose, and went back in for the last one. The beam came down without warning. No crack first, no sound of stress, just the weight of it sudden and complete, catching him across the left shoulder and taking him to the ground. He hit the dirt hard enough to knock the breath out of him, and then the beam was across his lower leg, and he pushed at it, and it didn't move, and the smoke was low and getting lower, and the horse in the stall 6 feet away was screaming. He pushed again. It didn't move. "Ethan," Abigail's voice from outside. "Ethan, answer me." "In here." He pushed a 3rd time, got his arms under the beam, shoved. It shifted 4 inches. Not enough. "Beam's down." "Abigail, get the horses clear first." "I'm not getting the horses," she said, and she was already inside. He heard her before he saw her through the smoke. Heard her coughing. Heard her hands on the beam, felt the weight shift as she got her shoulder under it from the other side. "On 3, she said, flat and focused. 1, 2. "Abigail, get out." 3. They both pushed. The beam shifted enough, just enough, that he got his leg free, and she grabbed his arm and pulled, and he got his feet under him, and they moved, and she still had his arm when they came out of the barn into air that tasted like the best thing he'd ever breathed. He went down on one knee. His leg was screaming. She went down with him, one hand on his back, coughing hard, and they stayed there for a moment with the fire cracking behind them and the horses running in the lower meadow and the smoke building overhead. "Can you walk?" she said. "Yes." "Don't lie to me." He tried. His leg held, barely. "I can walk." "Then walk." She got her shoulder under his arm. "We need to get to the creek." They moved together across the yard, him limping her, holding steady. Both of them moving with the purpose of people who have made a clear decision and are not discussing it further. They got to the creek bank. He sat down on the ground heavily, and she crouched beside him, and she put both hands on his leg, without asking permission, and pressed along the bone with the careful systematic efficiency of someone who had done this before or had read enough to know how. "Not broken," she said. "I know. Deep bruise. Could be a crack, but I don't think so." She sat back. Her face was gray with smoke, and there was a burn across the back of her left hand, shallow but red and angry, and she hadn't mentioned it, and probably wasn't going to. "Your hand," he said. She looked at it like she'd forgotten. "It's fine." "Abigail." "It's fine." She looked back at the barn. The fire was cresting the ridge and burning down the eastern face, but the wind had shifted again. He could see it in the smoke, and it was cutting south now away from the house. The barn had smoke rolling out of it, but the structure was standing. The horses were in the lower meadow, all of them, because she'd gotten the last 2 out while he was inside under the beam. She'd gotten them all out. He stared at her. She was looking at the ridge, calculating the notebook of her mind running figures. She'd come back into a burning barn for him. She'd done it without deliberating, without weighing it, without what he could see was any meaningful hesitation. She'd just come in the way you go towards something that needs doing when you've already decided what kind of person you are. He didn't have words for what that cost him. "There's something I have to tell you," she said. She was still looking at the ridge. He waited. She took a breath, let it out. The money in Caldwell County. The $40. Another breath. I told you I didn't take it. That's true. But I didn't tell you all of it. His chest went very still. She turned and looked at him. Her eyes were clear. No performance, no careful management, just the face of a woman who had carried something alone long enough and had finally decided to set it down in front of someone. It was Thomas, she said. My brother. He borrowed it. He was going to put it back. He panicked and he made a terrible choice, and he was 22 years old, and they were talking about prison. Her voice was level. Her hands were not, they were pressed flat against her knees, hard the way she pressed things when she was keeping them still. So I told the board it was me. I signed a statement. I took the censure. I let them take my position. And then I put Thomas on a stage to Oregon, and I told him it was a misunderstanding, and it was handled. She stopped. The fire moved on the ridge. A horse called from the lower meadow. He doesn't know, Ethan said. No. You did it so he wouldn't have a record. I did it so he wouldn't hang. Her voice broke on the last word just slightly, and she pressed her lips together and held it. In that county with that judge with the amount they were talking about adding on, yes. That was a real possibility. Ethan sat with that. He sat with the weight of it, the full shape of it, the specific dimensions of what this woman had done and what it had cost her and what she'd said nothing about to anyone for over a year. And you came here, he said slowly. I had no position, no reference anyone would accept, no town that didn't already know the board's version. She looked at her burned hand. The agency didn't ask too many questions, and your letter was honest. You didn't pretend to be offering something you weren't. Something moved in her face. I respected that. He almost laughed. It came out of him entirely against his will, just a short, rough sound. I offered you a roof and a wage. You offered me exactly what you had, and you were straight about it. She met his eyes. Do you know how rare that is? He didn't answer that. He couldn't quite. Why are you telling me now? He said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, because you went into that barn for a horse, and I went in for you, and after that... She paused. After that, it felt wrong not to. He looked at her for a long time. She let him look. I wrote to Ames, he said. I know. What I didn't tell you is that I also wrote to the school board president, directly. I told him I had questions about the investigation process, and I expected a written response. He held her gaze. I have standing in this territory. I have a name that carries weight in county matters, and I haven't used it for anything in 10 years, but I'm using it for this. Her expression shifted, opened in a way he hadn't seen before. Ethan. Don't thank me, he said. I'm not doing it to be thanked. Then why? He looked at her hand, at the burn across her knuckles, at the smoke still in her hair, and the gray still on her face, and the way she was sitting on a creek bank after pulling him out of a burning barn, talking about her brother, looking at him like she wasn't sure what to do with someone who didn't require her to be alone. Because it's right, he said. That's enough reason. She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked away, out toward the meadow, where the horses were settling. Clara's going to hear about the fire, she said. She will. She'll be scared. I'll send word to the Henderson place tonight. Abigail nodded. She was already moving forward, already organizing what came next, because that was what she did. She met things head on, and she organized them, and she kept moving, and he had spent 10 years calling that kind of motion in himself. Practicality. And he was beginning to understand that what he'd actually been doing was surviving, and that surviving and living were not as close to the same thing as he'd told himself they were. 3 hours later, the fire had burned itself out against the rocky north face of Dead Horse Ridge. The barn was damaged, but standing the east wall had taken the worst of it. The roof beams above the horse stalls were gone. Ethan's leg had stiffened badly, and he was moving with the careful deliberateness of a man trying not to show how much it cost him to move at all. Abigail had wrapped her hand without being asked, dressed the burn clean, and said nothing about it. She'd also made a full list of the structural damage to the barn, the horses that needed checking, and the immediate repairs required, which she handed to him, written in that precise, controlled hand that he'd been looking at for weeks now, and had come to recognize the way you recognize something that has become familiar without you deciding to let it. He was sitting at the kitchen table with the list when there was a knock at the door. Fast, urgent. He got up too fast, his leg complained hard, and opened the door to find Clara. She was filthy. She'd been running. Her eyes were too wide and she was breathing in the gulping, irregular way of a child who had cried the whole way and was trying to stop now that she'd arrived. "I saw the smoke," she said. "I saw it from the road, and She looked past him. "Is Miss Abigail?" "I'm here." Abigail came out of the kitchen. She crossed the front room and crouched down in front of Clara and put both hands on the girl's face, and Clara made a sound that was not quite a word and grabbed onto her, and Abigail held on her burned hand and all and said nothing, because nothing was what was needed. Ethan stood at the door and watched. He'd been alone on this mountain for 10 years. He'd told himself he'd chosen it. He'd told himself the solitude was what the work required, what his temperament required, what the particular damage of losing Margaret required. He'd built his life around the specific shape of being without. He looked at Abigail on her knees in his front room with a child's arms around her neck, and at the barn list on the table, and at the 2 coffee cups still on the counter from this morning, and at the chair by the kitchen window where she sat in the evenings writing in her notebook while he did the account books, the chair that had been empty for 9 years before she arrived, and that he now could not look at without expecting to see her there. He thought about the letter he'd written. Practical. Economical. I need someone who can endure the winters and expect nothing sentimental in return. He pressed his mouth together. What a foolish letter that had been. When Clara had calmed down and been fed and been walked home by Abigail as the sun was dropping low, Ethan watching them go from the porch. Clara's small hand in Abigail's unburned one, he sat down in the kitchen in the quiet and did something he hadn't done in a long time. He let himself sit with what he felt, not analyze it, not file it somewhere useful, not convert it into a task or a responsibility or a practical consideration. Just feel it the way it actually was. And what it was this: he did not want her to leave. He had not wanted it from approximately the 3rd day, and he had been calling it by every other name since then, because the right name was the one he'd spent 10 years believing he didn't need anymore. He heard her boots on the porch. She came in and looked at him sitting at the table and stopped in the doorway. "You should be resting that leg," she said. "Sit down, Abigail." She sat. The lamp was low. The house was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the lower meadow, one of the mares was moving slowly through the grass. He could hear her. "Margaret," he said. Her name was Margaret Hale. She died of fever in the spring of 1876. We were supposed to marry in June. He looked at his hands on the table. "I had the house half built. The south bedroom was going to be hers. I finished building it after. I don't know why. It seemed important to finish it." Abigail said nothing. She didn't try to fill it. "I told myself the ranch was enough," he said. "That working the land was enough. That a man could be complete without—" He stopped, looked at her. "I was wrong." She held his gaze. "I don't know what to do with that yet," he said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I don't know how to move from where I've been to somewhere else, but I know that I'm starting to want to." The lamp flickered. Abigail looked at him with the same creek-water eyes that had looked at him over the barrel of a revolver on the first day, and there was something in them now that was entirely different from that first day. Something quieter. Something that had been earned slowly. Something that had cost them both. "I'm not in any hurry," she said. It was the right thing to say. It was exactly the right thing. He nodded once. She nodded back. And they sat together in the kitchen, with the long summer dark settling around the house, and the horses quiet in the meadow and the burned ridge cooling in the distance, and neither of them said anything more, and it was the most honest conversation he'd had in 10 years. He didn't sleep well for the first 3 days after the fire, and it wasn't the leg. The leg was bad enough, deep bruising along the shin, something strained in the knee that the county doctor, when he finally rode up on the second day, confirmed was not broken, but was also not going to be walked on normally for at least 2 weeks. Dr. Callum had wrapped it, given instructions, Ethan mostly listened to, and left a bottle of something for the pain that Ethan put in the cabinet and didn't open. The thing that kept him awake was not the leg. It was the particular discomfort of a man who has spent 10 years being competent at everything and has suddenly been made dependent on another person for the basic functions of his own life. He couldn't get to the barn without help. He couldn't manage the water rounds. He couldn't do the fence checks or work the horses or haul the repair lumber for the east barn wall. He could sit, and he could direct, and he could watch Abigail do what needed doing, and that was the whole of what was available to him, and it was one of the harder things he'd endured in recent memory. She didn't make it worse by being gracious about it. That was the thing he hadn't expected. He'd braced himself for some form of careful, deliberate kindness, the hovering management of an invalid that would have made him feel the limitation more, but Abigail didn't hover. She came in each morning, told him what she'd done and what still needed doing, asked 2 or 3 specific questions, got his answers, and went. She treated him like a man who had information she needed, and a leg that was temporarily unavailable, in roughly that order of importance, and the efficiency of it was the only thing that made the situation bearable. On the 4th morning she came in and set coffee in front of him and a list on the table and said, "The 3 mares in the South Corral are fine. The sorrel colt has a minor burn on his left rear fetlock. I've been cleaning it twice daily, and it's improving. The east barn wall needs 6 new uprights before the roof beams can go back. I've sent word to Hicks about borrowing his post driver." He looked at the list, then at her. "You sent word to Hicks. You said last summer he'd helped you with the waterline repair. I thought he might be willing. You could have asked me first." She looked at him with the patient, steady look that meant she had already considered whether to do exactly that and decided against it. "You were asleep." "I wasn't asleep. You were pretending to be asleep so I wouldn't ask you for a decision at 6 in the morning when you'd been awake half the night." She picked up her coffee. "Which is a reasonable thing to do. I went ahead." He stared at her. She looked back without any apology in it, but without challenge either. Just the plain fact of a woman who had made a judgment call and stood behind it. "Hicks is a good man," Ethan said finally. "That's what I thought." He almost smiled. He stopped himself, but only barely. Hicks came the next morning with 2 of his hands and the post driver, and enough goodwill to make Ethan feel the weight of how long he'd been refusing to need anything from anybody. The man didn't say a word about the fire or the damage or Ethan's leg. He looked at the barn wall, looked at the lumber Abigail had already stacked and sorted, and said, "All right, let's get after it." And that was the whole of it. Ethan sat on the porch and watched and did not enjoy a single moment of watching. But he watched because it was the only thing he had. Abigail moved between the house and the barn all morning, carrying water and tools and answering Hicks's questions about where materials were kept with the ease of a woman who had known this property for years rather than weeks. He watched that too. The way she'd learned the ranch, not just its layout, but its logic, the way things connected to other things, the way a problem in one place meant a consequence 3 places over. Around noon, she brought food out for the crew, and Hicks took his plate and looked at Ethan on the porch and said without any particular weight on it, "You got a good one there, Walker." Ethan said nothing. Hicks ate his food and didn't push it. But Ethan sat with those 5 words for a long time, turning them over. "You got a good one there." The plainness of it. The simple accuracy. The letter from Gerald Ames arrived 6 days after the fire, and it arrived at the same time as something else. Something Ethan hadn't asked for and hadn't expected. Abigail brought both in from the post together. She set the Ames letter on the table in front of him, and held the other one herself, and she looked at it with an expression he recognized now as her processing face, the one she wore when something had arrived that required her to make a decision before she reacted to it. "What is it?" he said. "It's from the Caldwell County School Board." She turned it over. "Official seal." He said nothing. He watched her open it. He watched her read it standing at the table, and he watched her face go through 3 different things in about 10 seconds, tightening, releasing, tightening again before she set it down. "They're reopening the investigation," she said. Her voice was careful. "Formally, Gerald Ames filed a petition for independent review. It was approved by the circuit court." She put her hand flat on the letter. "Ethan, someone found a second ledger." He went still. "What kind of ledger?" "The kind that shows where the $40 actually went." She looked up at him. It wasn't Thomas. It wasn't even close to Thomas. Her voice had gone to somewhere quiet and shaking underneath the surface control. It was the board treasurer, James Whitfield. He'd been skimming from the school fund for 2 years. Thomas's borrowing it moved on the same day as one of Whitfield's withdrawals, and Whitfield pointed at Thomas and I. She stopped. "And you were trying to protect Thomas," Ethan said, "so you didn't look at whether anyone else had more reason to be guilty." She pressed her eyes shut for a second. "If I hadn't confessed, they might have investigated properly. Or Whitfield might have buried it deeper. I should have fought it. Abigail," he said her name quietly but firmly. "You were protecting your brother from a judge who would have put him away. You made the decision you thought you had to make. That's different from doing something wrong." She opened her eyes. They were bright but controlled. "He's been teaching school for 2 years in another county. Whitfield. After what he did." The quiet anger in those words was something he hadn't heard from her before, not the held-back kind she used for Greer and Ruth Danforth and the Henderson boy. This was older and deeper, the anger of a woman who had given something irreplaceable and was only now finding out exactly who had taken it. "Read the Ames letter," she said. He opened it. Ames wrote the way he suspected the man spoke, careful, precise, committed to the facts. The independent review had been granted. A hearing was scheduled. Abigail's name had been formally placed on the petition for exoneration. Her presence in Caldwell County was not required, but would strengthen the petition considerably. And at the bottom, a single sentence that Ames had clearly added after the main body of the letter, the handwriting slightly different. "I believed you then, Miss Reed. I am glad the record will reflect that I was right." Ethan put the letter down. "You need to go," he said. She looked at him. "Your leg is healing. I can manage. The barn repair isn't finished. Hicks will come back. He said he would." He held her gaze. "Abigail, your name is on a petition. You need to be there." She looked at the 2 letters side by side on the table for a long moment. He could see the calculation running in her every moving piece, every responsibility, everything she'd told herself she owed to the management of this ranch and to the life she'd been building on this mountain, weighed against the thing that had been waiting a 1.5 years to be resolved. "I'll be gone at least 2 weeks, she said. "I know. Clara. I'll look in on her." That stopped her. She looked at him with the particular expression she got when he did something that landed outside the box she'd put him in. "You will?" "She needs someone to look in on her. I'm here. The Hendersons aren't going to argue with me about it." He said it like it was a simple fact, like it hadn't cost him anything to decide. She looked at him for a long time. Then she sat down across from him and she picked up the Ames letter and she read the last line again, and this time she didn't manage the brightness in her eyes quite as well. "I believed you then, Miss Reed," she said half to herself. "He was right to," Ethan said. She looked up at him, and something in her face was so open and unguarded that he made himself look away toward the window, toward the horses in the pasture, anywhere that gave her a moment to pull it back if she wanted it. When he looked back, she had, but not all the way, not the way she used to. "I'll leave Friday," she said. "I'll have the buckboard ready." She left on Friday, and the house went quiet, in a way it hadn't been quiet since before she'd arrived, which was a different kind of quiet from the one he'd known before. Before, the quiet had been complete, no gaps in it, nothing missing, because nothing had been there to miss. This quiet had shape. It had the outline of a person in it. He managed. He was stubborn enough, and the leg was improving fast enough that by the end of the first week, he was moving nearly normally, which meant he could get to the barn, get to the horses, get to the water rounds. He couldn't do everything at full speed, but he could do enough. He checked on Clara twice that week. The first time he knocked at the Henderson door and asked stiffly whether the girl could come and water the garden for an hour since Miss Reed was away and the garden needed tending. The Henderson woman looked at him for a moment and then called for Clara without argument, which confirmed Abigail's assessment that the Hendersons were not cruel people, just incurious ones, which was its own kind of failure, but a manageable one. Clara came and watered the garden and then stood at the edge of it with her hands at her sides, looking at the house. "She's coming back," the girl said. "She is," Ethan said. "How do you know?" He looked at the girl. She was asking a real question. The question of someone who had been left before and knew what it felt like and was not interested in being told comfortable things that turned out not to be true. "Because she told me she would," he said, "and she doesn't say things she doesn't mean." Clara thought about that. "All right," she said finally. He brought her back the second time midweek and sat at the kitchen table with his account books while she practiced writing in the back of Abigail's lesson notebook. She'd found it herself, located it on the shelf without asking, and sat down with it and a pencil, with the confidence of someone who had been welcomed in this house, enough to know where things were. He watched her briefly from over the top of his ledger. She had her tongue between her teeth, and she was writing her own name slowly, letter by letter the way Abigail had taught her. He looked back at the ledger. Something in his chest felt different from how it had felt in the morning, and he did not examine it too carefully, and he let it be. Abigail had been gone 9 days when Walt Greer made his third move. This one came not in person, but on paper, a formal letter county seal delivered through the land office. It informed Ethan Walker that a complaint had been filed with the County Water Board regarding irregularities in the East Boundary water rights documentation. The matter would require a review hearing. Pending the outcome, the rights were considered contested. He read it twice. Then he folded it, put it in his chest pocket, and sent a writer to his lawyer in town, a man named Alderman Cole, who was not flashy and not cheap, and who had handled Ethan's property matters for 12 years with the methodical determination of someone who enjoyed being right more than being liked. Cole came out the next morning. He read the letter. He read the original water rights documentation. He asked Ethan 3 precise questions and listened to the answers. "Greer's used a clerical irregularity from the original 1879 filing," Cole said. "The boundary survey notation uses an abbreviation that's technically ambiguous. It's thin. But in front of the right commissioner, thin can be enough. Can you fight it?" "I can. I'll need the original surveyor's field notes if they exist." "They exist. I have them." Cole nodded, made a note. "There's something else." Ethan waited. "Greer's been talking to people, not publicly, quietly. He's been suggesting that your household situation represents a liability, that a woman with a pending complaint in another county attached to your property creates grounds for questions about the stability of the operation." Cole looked at him steadily. "He's trying to build a case that your judgment has been compromised." The specific ugliness of that landed in Ethan's chest like something thrown hard. "Her situation," Ethan said, keeping his voice even, "is currently being formally reviewed and is expected to result in full exoneration." "That will help when it's complete." Cole paused. "Is there something I should know about the Caldwell County matter?" Ethan told him. "All of it. The board decision, the independent, review the second ledger, Whitfield." He told it plainly and without editorializing the way he'd have told it if he were giving testimony, and Cole listened without expression until it was done. "Send me whatever you have from the Ames correspondence," Cole said. "I want it in the file." He stood. "Greer's playing a long game. He thinks your attention is divided. He's not wrong that it is, but divided attention isn't the same as compromised judgment, and I can make that argument in front of any commissioner in this territory." After Cole left, Ethan sat alone at the table for a long time. He thought about Greer and his long game and the East Water Line. He thought about Abigail standing on his porch looking down at Greer's hired evaluator, saying, "We like it cost her nothing." He thought about how much it had actually cost her and how she'd done it anyway, and he felt something harden in him, not anger exactly. Resolve. The particular resolve of a man who has decided which side of a line he's on and is done reconsidering. He picked up a pen and wrote to Cole. He wrote to Ames. He wrote a third letter to the Caldwell County Circuit Clerk, formally registering his interest in the outcome of the exoneration petition, on the grounds of being the petitioner's household partner and primary character witness. He'd never written the word partner with reference to another person in 9 years. He looked at it on the page for a moment, left it. Abigail came back on a Thursday, 12 days after she'd left, and she came back alone on the stage, which meant she'd sent the rented horse ahead and had time to think on the road without the management of an animal to occupy her hands. He heard the stage before he saw it. He'd been waiting, which he told himself was because he needed a report on the Caldwell County hearing, and which was also less comfortably because he'd been sleeping better since the 4th day after she left, when he'd accepted that the sleep difficulty had nothing to do with the leg. She climbed down and she looked different. Not older, something else. Like a weight had shifted in her posture. Something she'd been holding upright for a long time had been given permission to rest. She looked at him standing in the yard, and she smiled. Not the careful, almost smile he'd learned to read as her version of warmth. A real one. It hit him somewhere unguarded, and he let it. "Well," he said. "Whitfield confessed," she said. 4 days into the review, his own bookkeeper found another ledger, a third one, and brought it to the court herself. Abigail walked toward him, and her voice was steady, but her eyes were not quite. "Full exoneration. The board issued a formal written apology. They offered me my position back." He stayed very still. "Which position?" "Senior teacher, with back pay for the 1.5 years I was out." She stopped a few feet from him. "And a letter of recommendation for any institution in the territory." The words landed between them, and neither of them moved for a moment. "What did you say?" he said. He kept his voice level. He could not entirely keep it neutral. "I told them I needed time to consider it." She looked at him. "I took the apology. I took the back pay. I left the position open." He looked at her. She looked back. "You left it open," he said. "I did." "Why?" She tilted her head slightly the way she did when she thought a question deserved more directness than she'd been given. "You know why." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned and picked up her bag, and she let him without reaching for it, and they walked toward the house side by side. "Greer filed a water rights challenge while you were gone," he said. "I know. Cole sent word to the Caldwell court I read his brief while I was there." She paused. "He's good. He is. Do you want me to write out what I remember from the board's process? The documentation procedural errors might be useful to Cole as a parallel." He stopped at the porch steps, turned to look at her. She was completely serious, travel-worn, just back from a hearing that had given her back her name and her reputation and an offer to return to the career she'd loved, and she was thinking about his water rights documentation. "Yes," he said. "I'd appreciate that." She nodded and went inside, and he stood on the porch for a moment before following her, and he thought about what Cole had said. Your attention is divided, and he thought that Cole was wrong. His attention wasn't divided. It had clarified into something more specific and more certain than anything he'd held in a long time. Clara was told that evening. Abigail went to the Henderson place herself, and when she came back, Clara was with her, and Clara was holding Abigail's hand with both of hers, and she didn't let go for the better part of an hour. They sat in the kitchen, all three of them, and Abigail told Clara she was back simply and directly without making it more than it was or less than it was. And Clara listened and nodded, and then said with the careful precision of a child who has been thinking about something important, "Miss Abigail, are you going to stay?" Abigail looked across the table at Ethan. He looked back. "I'm thinking about it," Abigail said. Clara considered this. "What's there to think about?" Ethan made a sound that was against all odds, something very close to a laugh. Abigail looked at him with the corner of her mouth doing the thing it did, and then she looked back at Clara and said, "That's a fair question." "You like it here," Clara said with the blunt certainty of childhood. "I can tell because you stop looking worried when you come through the door. People don't do that in places they don't like." The kitchen went quiet. Ethan looked at Clara with the particular attention he gave to things that were more precise than he expected. Then he looked at Abigail. She was looking at him too. Her face was doing the thing he'd seen twice now, opening the careful barriers coming partially down the thing underneath, showing through. That particular mix of wary and wanting that he recognized because he'd been wearing it himself for weeks. "She's not wrong," he said quietly. Abigail held his gaze. "No," she said. "She's not." Clara looked between them with the satisfied expression of a child who has caused an important thing to happen and knows it, and she picked up her pencil and went back to her letters. He told her about Margaret that night, not in pieces the way it had come out before, a fragment here, a closed door there, but all of it from the beginning. He told her how they'd met, how he'd built this house with the idea of her in it, how he'd come out to Montana with $20 and a determination that was embarrassing to look back on. Now how she'd agreed to come west and marry him, and how she'd gotten sick on the way and hadn't made it past the Kansas border. How he'd gotten a telegram. How he'd stood in the middle of what was then barely a rough-framed structure and decided to finish building it anyway because stopping felt like letting the grief win, and he wasn't built for that. He told her how he'd spent 10 years becoming very good at being without, and how he'd started to think that was the same thing as being fine. He told her all of it without stopping, without editing. Looking at his hands on the table, and when he was done, he looked up. She hadn't looked away. She was watching him with an expression he didn't have a word for. Not pity. Nothing like pity. Something much closer to recognition. The look of someone who had also been carrying a thing alone and had come to understand the weight of it from the inside. She reached across the table. She put her hand over his. She didn't say anything. She didn't try to find the words that would fix it because she was too smart for that, and they both knew nothing fixed it. It just became something you carried differently over time, something that changed shape as you moved with it. She just kept her hand there. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat that way for a long time. Outside, the summer night was full, warm and close. The horses settled in the pasture, the ridge dark and cooling above the tree line. The lamp burned low between them. He thought about the letter he'd written 6 months ago. The economical, precise, impersonal letter. "I need someone who can endure the winters." He thought about the woman sitting across from him, who had endured things that had nothing to do with Montana winters, and had come through them without losing a single essential thing. Not her spine, not her honesty, not her ability to walk into a burning barn for someone else when the choice was available to her. He thought about what it meant that she was still here. He thought about the school board's offer sitting open waiting for her answer. He thought about what he wanted to say, and whether he had the right to say it yet. And then he thought about 10 more years of being very good at being without, and he decided he'd been careful long enough. "The position they offered you," he said. She looked at him. "Would you be happy teaching again, being back in that work?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "Yes. Teaching it's what I'm made for. Clara showed me that I hadn't lost it." She paused. "But it's not the only thing I'm made for. I know that now." "What else?" She looked at him steadily. "This," she said simply. "Running something, building something, seeing what a place can become when someone actually pays attention to it." A pause. "Being somewhere that stops looking like a transaction." He was quiet for a moment. "It stopped being a transaction a long time ago." "I know," she said. "I know it did." He looked at their hands. "I can't promise you I'm going to be easy," he said. I've spent 10 years doing everything alone, and I don't know how to stop all at once. I'm going to get it wrong. I'm going to... Ethan. Her voice was quiet and firm and faintly amused. I brought a revolver to our first meeting. I'm not expecting easy. He looked at her. She looked at him. And the laugh that came out of him that time was real low and genuine, and surprised the laugh of a man remembering how it felt to be caught off guard by something good. She smiled, the real one. He held her hand a little tighter. Stay, he said. It was only one word. It was the most direct thing he'd said in 10 years. She looked at him for a long moment. Her thumb moved once across his knuckle. Yes, she said. Outside, one of the mares called from the pasture low and easy, just an animal acknowledging the night. The lamp burned. The house held its quiet around them, and it was not the quiet of absence anymore. It was the quiet of two people who had found by the longest and most unlikely road exactly where they were supposed to be. The word yes changed something in the structure of the house. Not immediately, not in any way Ethan could have pointed to and named. But it was there in the mornings, in the way they moved around each other in the kitchen, without the careful distance they'd maintained for the first weeks. It was there, in the way she left her notebook open on the table now, instead of closing it when he came in. It was there in the way he'd started telling her things, before she asked what he planned for the week, what concerned him about the East pasture, what Cole had said about the water rights hearing. Small things. The ordinary currency of two people who had agreed without announcing it to stop being strangers. He didn't call it anything. He didn't put a name to it, and she didn't ask him to. They were both too old for that kind of hurrying and too careful, and whatever was building between them was building on solid ground because they were letting it go at its own pace, and he thought that was the right way. What he hadn't accounted for was Thomas. The letter came on a Monday, forwarded through the Caldwell County Records Office. Abigail's brother writing from Oregon, where he'd been for over a year, living with what he thought was a debt he'd never been allowed to properly repay. The handwriting was nothing like Abigail's controlled precision. It sprawled across the page with the urgency of a man writing faster than he could think. Ethan wasn't in the room when she read it. He came in from the barn and found her at the table with the letter in both hands, and her face doing something he'd only seen twice before, that hairline fracture in the surface, the thing underneath pushing through before she could stop it. He sat down. He didn't ask. He waited. He knows, she said. How? The exoneration was published in the Caldwell County Record. She set the letter down carefully, like it was something that might break. It listed the correct guilty party. It listed my name as the wrongly censured party. He read it in a newspaper. Her voice was steady on the surface and shaking beneath it. He's been sitting in Oregon for 6 days since he read it, trying to figure out what to say. What does he say? She turned the letter and pushed it across the table to him. He read it. It was not a long letter. It was the letter of a 22-year-old man who had just discovered that his sister had stepped in front of a moving train on his behalf, and he hadn't known, and the words were not eloquent, and they were not organized, and they were completely, devastatingly real. I didn't know. I swear to God, Abby, I didn't know. I would never have let you. I would never. Tell me what I can do. Tell me anything. I'll come there. I'll go to the board myself. I'll tell them everything. Tell me what you need me to do, and I'll do it. Ethan put the letter down. He wants to come, she said. I know. The exoneration is already complete. There's nothing he can fix. I know that too. She looked at him. Then what do I tell him? He thought about it plainly and honestly, the way she'd always responded to. Tell him to come, not to fix anything, just to come. Because he's your brother, and he's been carrying something he didn't know he was carrying, and you've been carrying it for him, and both of you have been alone with it long enough. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were bright and controlled, and he could see the effort it took to hold them that way. You think the ranch can manage one more? She said, and the lightness in her voice was only partial, only a way of asking a real question sideways. I think the barn's got a spare room now that we fixed the east wall, he said. And I've got 2 seasons of writing work that needs an extra hand if he's willing. She looked down at the letter. Then she looked up at him, and she didn't try to manage her face. And for a few seconds it was completely open, grateful and tired, and relieved all at once, in the way of someone who has been managing everything alone for so long that being offered something solid to lean against is for a moment almost more than they know what to do with. "All right," she said. She picked up her pen and wrote back that same afternoon. He left her to it and went to look at the horses, which was what he did when he needed to give someone room, and didn't know another way to say so. Cole came out on Wednesday with news about the water rights hearing, and it was not the news Ethan had hoped for. "Greer's gotten to Commissioner Aldrich," Cole said, setting his papers on the kitchen table with the air of a man who had expected this and prepared for it. "Aldrich is going to preside over the review. He and Greer go back to the territorial survey days they were on the same land grant committee in '78. Ethan went still. "Can we get a different commissioner? We can request one, but the request goes through Aldrich's office first." Abigail had been sitting at the far end of the table reviewing Cole's documentation, and she looked up. "What's the basis for the clerical irregularity Greer filed?" Cole looked at her. He'd adjusted to her presence at these conversations faster than Ethan had expected after the first meeting. He'd simply started directing his explanations to both of them with the efficient pragmatism of a lawyer who recognized when the second person in the room was worth talking to. The 1879 survey used the notation RWB for the boundary marker. Greer's filing argues it means running water boundary, which shifts the line 18 feet south and puts the primary feed channel on his side. Walker's position is that it means rock wall base, a physical marker that puts the line where it's always been. "What do the original field notes say?" Abigail asked. "That's the problem. The surveyor's field notes use the same abbreviation, no expansion." "Who was the surveyor?" "Man named Theodore Grawl. He's been dead since 1882. Abigail was quiet for a moment, looking at the documentation. "Did Grawl survey other properties in this county in 1879? Cole paused. "He did. 4 others. "Do any of those surveys use RWB in a context where we could determine which definition applies a property without a stream where running water boundary would be impossible, then the notation would have to mean the physical marker?" Cole stared at her. Then he wrote something in his notebook rapidly. "Mrs. Walker," he said, and neither of them corrected the name. "I need to pull those 4 surveys." "I can go to the county office," she said. "I know what I'm looking for, and I can read survey notation." Cole looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Abigail. Something in his chest did the thing it kept doing lately when she was directly in front of him, doing something that confirmed for the 100th time that she was exactly who he'd understood her to be. "Take the bay mare," he said. "She's faster than the road horse." Abigail was already closing the notebook. "Jim." She came back the next evening with 2 of the 4 surveys and a look on her face that was the closest thing to triumph he'd seen from her. Though on her it wore quietly contained in the set of her jaw and the speed of her walk across the yard. She spread the surveys on the kitchen table. She pointed to a parcel from 1879, a dry land property in the north of the county, no waterways. And there in Grawl's hand was RWB, marking the boundary off a granite outcropping on the eastern edge. "No stream within half a mile," she said. "So RWB cannot mean running water boundary on this property. It has to mean the rock feature." She set the second survey beside it, a similar notation, similar context. Grawl used it consistently. It was his abbreviation for physical rock markers. Cole can put both of these in front of any commissioner in the territory, and the argument is over. Ethan looked at the surveys. He looked at her. "You found this in one day," he said. "I knew what I was looking for." "Abigail." She looked up. "Thank you," he said. He meant it down to the floor. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up the surveys and squared the edges and set them ready for Cole, and she said as if it were simply obvious, "It's our land." Our land. He heard it. He let it settle. He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything that needed saying. But he stood in his kitchen, and he thought that there were some words that once spoken plainly and without ceremony became permanent. Facts rather than feelings. Things that had been true for a while and had finally found their language. Bid. Cole took the surveys to the county office on Friday. The formal challenge to Greer's filing was submitted the same day. By the following Tuesday, Commissioner Aldrich had received a letter from 3 of the other property owners whose 1879 surveys had been filed by Theodore Grawl, all confirming that RWB had always referred to the rock boundary marker in their deeds, all requesting that the Walker Water Rights Review be conducted without prejudice. Abigail had written those letters. She'd written them after Cole identified the property owners, drafted them in one evening, and sent them out herself, and she hadn't told Ethan until after they were gone. "You could have asked me," he said. "You were working the horses." He looked at her. She looked back with that expression, the patient one, the one that was also slightly amused at his insistence on being consulted about things that she'd already handled. "I'm starting to think," he said slowly, "that you do that on purpose." "Do what?" "Handle things while I'm with the horses." The corner of her mouth moved. "The horses take a long time." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went back to the horses, and he heard her laugh behind him, a real one, low and genuine, and he walked into the barn with it following him, and he let it. Greer came one last time, not with a foreman and a hired evaluator, not with the authority of the county land committee behind him. He came alone on a Wednesday morning, and he rode up slowly and stopped in the yard and looked at Ethan like a man who has reassessed a situation and arrived at a conclusion he doesn't entirely like, but is prepared to live with. "The challenge is being dropped," Greer said. "County office will send the paperwork." Ethan stood in the yard with his arms at his sides. "All right." Greer's jaw worked. "Your surveyor argument was solid. I'll give you that." "It was my wife's argument," Ethan said. The word came out easy. It came out like it had always been there. Greer looked past him. Abigail was on the porch. She met Greer's gaze without moving. "Ma'am," Greer said. "Mr. Greer," she said. He looked back at Ethan. Something in his face was older than it had been the last time, not softened exactly, but recalibrated. The look of a man who knows he lost and is deciding what kind of man he'll be about it. "You've got good water," Greer said. "I still want it." "I know you do. If you ever decide to negotiate—" "I won't," Ethan said. "But I'll tell you the same as I've always told you. You want water talk to me about a shared usage arrangement. Not a transfer, not a purchase. A usage agreement with clear terms and both names on it." Greer was quiet for a moment. "I'll think on that. You know where to find me." Greer touched his hat to Ethan, and then a beat later to Abigail on the porch, and he turned his horse and rode back down the hill. Ethan watched him go. When he turned around, Abigail was leaning against the porch post with her arms crossed, looking at him with an expression he'd learned to read as her version of satisfaction. "Usage agreement," she said. "It's fair. I know it's fair. I'm just noting that you left the door open. Man's got water problems. I've got leverage. Leverage is more useful as a relationship than a conclusion." He came up the porch steps. "You would have done the same." She considered this. "Yes," she said. "I would have." He stood next to her on the porch, and they looked out at the property together. The corrals, the repaired barn, the horses moving in the south pasture, the long sweep of the valley below, and the ridge above it, dark green against the summer blue. "Cole says the paperwork will be final by next week," she said. "Good. Then it's over." "Then it's over," he agreed. She uncrossed her arms, and her hand brushed his, and neither of them moved away, and they stood there on the porch of the house he'd built for someone else, and finished out of stubbornness and lived in alone for 10 years, and it felt for the first time like exactly the right size. Thomas arrived on a Saturday at the end of July. He was younger looking than Ethan had expected from the letter, or maybe it was that the letter had been written in such distress that he'd imagined someone older, someone worn down. But the man who climbed off the stage in Millhaven was 22 years old and looked it thin from a year of Oregon winters and ranch work, with Abigail's same direct eyes, and a jaw that held itself the same way hers did, braced against whatever was coming. Abigail was there to meet him. Ethan had offered to come, and she'd said no. Gently, clearly, the way she said things she'd thought through. "Let me have a few minutes with him first." So Ethan waited at the ranch, and when the buckboard came up the hill 2 hours later, and he went out to meet it, Thomas climbed down and stood in the yard and looked at his sister, and then at Ethan, and he was holding himself together by sheer force of will, in the way of someone who has been doing it since the stage left Millhaven. Ethan put out his hand. "Ethan Walker." Thomas shook it. His grip was firm, the grip of a man who worked with his hands and knew what it meant. "Thomas Reed." He paused. "Sir?" "Just Ethan." He looked at the younger man steadily. "You eat on the road?" "Not much." "Come inside." He fed Thomas at his kitchen table and let the conversation go where it needed to go without managing it, which was the right thing to do, and also the thing that was hardest for him. So he got up and checked on the horses twice, while Abigail and Thomas talked, and the talk moved through the things it needed to move through the apology. Thomas couldn't stop making the forgiveness. Abigail kept trying to offer the specific, painful accounting of what the year and a half had cost each of them. He came back in the second time, and Thomas looked at him with the red-eyed composure of a man who has just finished crying and is embarrassed about it and also past caring. "She said you wrote to the records office," Thomas said, "and to the board." "I did." "Why?" Ethan looked at him directly. "Because the math didn't add up. And because she's—" He stopped. He looked at Abigail, who was watching him with her hands around her coffee cup. "Because she's who she is," he said. "And people who are who she is shouldn't have to carry other people's weight alone." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I'm going to pay back the $40, he said, "to the school fund, whatever's left of it." "That's between you and the fund," Ethan said, "and I'm going to write to the board, formally, even though the case is closed. I want it on record that it was me." "Thomas," Abigail started. "It was me, Abby. It goes on record." He looked at her with a steadiness that was the first steadiness Ethan had seen from him. "You can't fix that for me." She looked at him. Then she nodded once, and that was that. Thomas stayed 2 weeks. He was a willing hand and a quick learner, and he had Abigail's habit of seeing what needed doing before being told, which meant within 4 days, he'd identified 3 things about the horse operation that were less efficient than they could be, and had the sense to ask before changing them. Ethan gave him the East Barn Room and put him on the morning water rounds, and by the end of the first week, it felt less like managing a guest, and more like running a slightly larger operation, which it was. On the last night before Thomas left, the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table after dinner, and Clara was there too. She'd taken to Thomas with the uncomplicated trust of a child who has been welcomed somewhere often enough to extend its warmth to the people connected to it. Clara showed Thomas her letters, all of them. The whole primer from the beginning, every word she knew read out loud at the kitchen table, with her spine straight and her voice deliberate, and Abigail's hand resting lightly on the table near hers. When she finished, Thomas looked at his sister over Clara's head. "You could have gone back," he said quietly. "To teaching. They offered you the position." "I know. You didn't take it." "I know that too." He looked around the kitchen. At Ethan across the table, at the notebook on the shelf, at the harness hanging by the door that someone had recently oiled, and the 2 coffee cups on the counter, and the child at the table reading her letters. "You found something better," he said. Abigail looked at Ethan. He looked at her. "Yes," she said. "I did." Thomas nodded slowly. He looked at Ethan with the measuring look of a younger man deciding whether someone has earned something. Whatever he found, he seemed to find it sufficient. He looked back at Clara. "Read it again," he said. "From the beginning. I want to hear the whole thing." Clara grinned and started over. Thomas left on a Monday with a job in the valley. Hicks had offered him seasonal work, which Ethan had had nothing to do with, and also had mentioned to Hicks in passing 2 weeks earlier, because he was a practical man. And practicality sometimes looked like caring if you didn't examine it too closely. The morning after Thomas left the ranch went back to its own rhythm. Just the two of them. The horses, the water rounds, the account books in the evening. But the rhythm was different from what it had been even a month ago. It had settled into itself. Stopped trying. He was at the fence line on the north pasture when Abigail came out with water and a folded paper, which meant either a letter or something from Cole, and the walk she was making across the pasture grass was not her urgent walk, so it wasn't trouble. She handed him the water and unfolded the paper. "From the school board in Mill Haven," she said. He looked at her. "Which board?" "Board. Mill Haven, not Caldwell." She held the letter where he could read it. "They're opening a school. Proper one. They've been raising money for 2 years. Building starts in September." She looked at the letter, not at him. They'd heard about the exoneration, and about Clara. Apparently Mrs. Hicks told Mrs. Callum, who told the board chairman. Her voice was careful the way it got when she was approaching something that mattered too much to be careless with. "They're asking if I'd consider teaching 2 days a week, mornings only. Not a full position just until they find someone full-time, or permanently part-time if that suited." He looked at the letter, then at her. 2 days a week. Monday and Wednesday. I'd be back by noon." He took the letter and read it himself, and it was exactly what she'd described, careful, respectful, the language of people who knew they were asking something from someone they'd treated badly by association, and were trying to get the asking right. "Clara would be a student," she said. "I figured. And any other child in the valley whose family wants it." He folded the letter, handed it back to her. She was watching him with that expression, the one that wasn't quite asking, because she was too careful to put herself in the position of needing him to say yes, but that was also not asking. "Abigail," he said. "Yes. Teaching is what you're made for. That's what you told me." "It's part of what I'm made for." "Then you should do it." She took the letter from his hand. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He turned back to the fence. "The morning rounds will be done by the time you leave. I'll need the east pasture water checked when you get back." She stood there for a moment. He could feel her standing there. Then, "You do that on purpose." He didn't turn around. Do what? Make things simple when they feel complicated. Make practicality sound like... She stopped. He turned around. She was looking at him with the open face, the one she didn't manage. The one that had stopped appearing rarely and had started appearing more and more like a window that had been painted shut, and someone had finally taken the time to clear it. "Like what?" he said. She pressed her lips together. Then, like love. The word sat between them in the open air of the north pasture on a summer morning, and neither of them moved, and the horses moved in the grass behind her, and the sky was the high blue of August, and Ethan Walker looked at this woman who had arrived on his porch with a revolver and one bag, and had proceeded in the span of a single summer to turn every hay bale right and teach a child to read and walk into a burning barn without hesitation, and argue his property rights on the basis of a dead surveyor's notation. And he thought that there was not a single word available to him that covered all of what he felt, and so he chose the one that covered the most of it. "Yes," he said. "Like that." She exhaled. It was not a dramatic sound. It was the sound of something that had been held carefully for a very long time, finally allowed to set itself down. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket. "The east pasture water," she said. "When you get back." She nodded. She turned and walked back toward the house, and after 3 steps, she stopped and turned around. "Ethan?" He waited. "I'm going to write to the board today." She looked at him steadily. "And say yes." "Good," he said. "And I'm going to tell them my name is Abigail Walker." He stood very still. She held his gaze without flinching, without the careful management, without the measured distance she'd maintained for weeks. Just looked at him plainly, the way she looked at everything that mattered to her, straight on and without apology. He took 3 steps across the grass and stopped in front of her, and he said low and certain, "I'd like that very much." She lifted her chin slightly. "I thought you might." He took her face in both hands, the rough, careful hands of a man who worked with horses and fences and heavy things, and he kissed her there in the north pasture on a summer morning, unhurried, the way you do something you've decided you're going to do right. When he pulled back, she was looking at him with that almost smile gone full, the real one, the one that changed everything in her face. "Practical," she said softly. "Always," he said. She laughed, and he held on to that sound. And above them, the summer blue went on, and below them, the valley spread wide and clear, and fully theirs. Clara learned to write her full name that October. Clara Benton, all 12 letters in a proper schoolroom with a wood floor and 2 windows sitting in the front row, because she'd been the first student registered because Abigail Walker had written her name on the list herself and dared anyone to remove it. Nobody did. Thomas Reed came back to the valley the following spring, permanent this time, with a letter from Hicks offering him a foreman position and a letter from the Caldwell County School Board confirming that his voluntary disclosure had been entered into the official record. He framed neither letter. He folded them and put them in his coat pocket and went to work. Walt Greer signed the water usage agreement in November with both names on it, Ethan Walker and Abigail Walker. And if he thought anything about those 2 names side by side on a legal document, he kept it to himself, which was the first wise thing anyone had seen him do in 7 years. And on the ridge above Dead Horse, where the fire had burned itself out against the rock that summer, the grass came back the following spring, green and thick, the way it always does after a burn. Not despite the fire, but because of it. Because sometimes the land has to lose everything that was dry and dead and ready to go before it can find out what was living underneath. Ethan had known that about land for 20 years. It had taken him longer to know it about himself. But he knew it now. He knew it every morning when he came in from the barn, and the coffee was already made, and the notebook was already open, and Abigail looked up at him over the top of it with those creek water eyes, and said without ceremony, "The east tank's down 2 inches. You'll want to check the line," and he said, "I know, I saw it." And they went about the work of the day together side by side on the mountain. They had both separately, and by entirely different roads found their way home too. Some people spend their whole lives looking for the place where they belong. Ethan Walker and Abigail Reed had each stopped expecting to find it. And then on a summer morning in Montana, over a cup of coffee and a list of water levels and the sound of horses in the pasture, they found it in each other. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.